listeners. The Dugout is all about sharing Black radical history and ideas to spark learning and action. If you've gained anything from these conversations, especially if you think we're cute, consider supporting us on Patreon. Your support helps us cover production costs, bringing on our amazing guests, getting Jordan all cozy before they smoke their little doobie before each episode, and beyond. Plus, you'll get early access to interviews and exclusive reading episodes. Head to patreon.com/thedugoutpod to join us and keep this work going.
To start, what was a young, I guess not doctor yet, MOHAMED ABDOU like? Where did you grow up? What were your experiences?
That's a beautiful question. I love the Quran very deeply. It's filled with a great deal of wisdom, parables, metaphors, teachings. Not a lot of people think or know that. They think that the Quran is a set of rules and dictums, if you will. In fact, that's 30% of the Quran. The rest are calling upon human beings to reflect their breath, the bird when it leaves its nest in the morning, not knowing where it's going to receive its nourish, or its children's, the rising of the sun in the east and its setting in the west. And I'm grateful to begin this way with you all, again, in the state of peace, alhamdulillah, and Shakina in Judaism, with a verse from the Quran. And it's Moses' prayer when they were about to meet Pharaoh. I'm going to say it in Arabic first. Allahumma shrah li sadri ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. اللهم اشرح لي صدري means, O Creator, open thy breast, open thy heart. ويسر لي أمري, and make my affairs easy. واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي, and undo the knot on my tongue such that, God willing, what it is that I have to share with all of you is received. My journey. I was born in Cairo, Egypt. I had extensive family at different points in my life, really all across the world, Middle East, but also at different times, Europe, Turtle Island. But I moved really I spent time in the US when I was very young, Cairo, the United Arab Emirates, specifically Abu Dhabi. My family, my parents had an extensive library, and I had a knack for reading. They weren't inherently political, they weren't inherently religious. I had an elder, Sheikh Jilani, was over 100 years old. He was in so many ways the one that taught me the Quran, how to listen to it before reading it, and how to understand it while reading it before memorizing. The earliest memory really that I have, my father was a Nasserite, advocate for Jamal Abdel Nasser. My mother was very much a Sadatist, advocated for Anwar Sadat. So it was very interesting always sitting at the living room table and witnessing political discussions, but also during Ramadan and having family gatherings, but also gatherings from the expat community who would come, and some of them were ambassadors, some of them were engineers, doctors, there would be jazz musicians. I mean, it was Ramadan, so we were breaking our fast and all kinds of political conversations that were unfolding. But my earliest memory really is around 14, 15, reading Frantz Fanon, the beautiful Martinique thinker, philosopher, poet, psychoanalyst, a lot revolutionary, militant. His book, Black Skin, White Masks. That was coupled with, well, as for a lot of Muslims particularly, and Black siblings, our shining Black prince, Malcolm's autobiography. They were so profound, those two texts. I saw myself in Jean Venus in chapter 3, Fanon's Black Skin, White Mask. I was the introverted person of color, if you will. There's multiple languages, loves to read, but is aspiring to the white man's world in so many different ways. And that is my favorite book by Fanon, simply because he taps into, in a very psychoanalytic way, the internalized, colonized person of color, woman of color, the exhibited, if you will, desires that are very productive. For him, it was, where does a Black man, where does a man of color fetishize a white body, and vice versa. So it's deeply, if you will, invigorating, unsettling, traumatizing, but liberating. I actually made a bonfire and burnt the two books. That's how profound. And it also really hit me because growing up and visiting mosques, Friday prayers, you're listening about the atrocities in Bosnia, I was in the Emirates during the first Gulf War, right? I was taken to an aircraft carrier. It was the USS Nassau, actually. My school had organized this trip to aircraft carrier, the USS Nassau, and it was practically like being in a city or a mega city, right? So you're seeing the F-16s, the F-18s, the weapons of mass destruction annihilation. Early helicopters that are named after indigenous people. The tomahawk weapons, right? Indigenous people are only regarded as signposts of history, particularly in the American psychosis, if you will, despite the ongoing genocide, the afterlife to slavery projects, all that maybe that we'll get to eventually, but the foundations of settler colonialism. But it really hit me like a ton of bricks. And I remember asking my teacher, given the fact that it was the Iraq War, well, what's going to happen to us if the UAE or Abu Dhabi is invaded? He says, well, you'll become the children of America, right? And yeah, really, it burgeoned from there. I came back to Egypt in the hopes of attending medical school. I got accepted into medical school, engineering as well. Wanted to become a cardiosurgeon, a neurosurgeon. I wanted to do the Che thing. And then I wrote an article against Mubarak and the Mubarak regime at the time, and my acceptances were rescinded. I was banned off university campuses. And so I actually ended up fleeing, if you will, and becoming a settler on Turtle Island. I was 45 minutes away from a Mohawk reserve. I landed in Kingston, Ontario, Anishinaabe Haudenosaunee territory. And shortly after that, it was 9/11. Before that, actually, it was Seattle, the anti-globalization movement of 99. That was sort of the real political, if you will, engagements at the level of the grassroots. 9/11, that's shortly after that, I met Elder Ashanti Alston, a former Black Panther and a member of the Black Liberation Army. One of the greatest honors of my life, becoming organized insofar as abolitionist politics, decolonial politics, understanding my place as a settler, as somebody who's complicit now in indigenous dispossession. And of course, settlerhood is, or being a settler is more of an analytic than anything else, right? But that doesn't take, I don't enjoy the same privileges as a white man on Turtle Island, but that doesn't mean that I'm not complicit in indigenous dispossession, because I have certain privileges that indigenous people, Black people, my Black siblings don't enjoy. The Zapatistas, to a certain point, and living with them, Tahrir. So really, yeah, the journey has been long. I've been doing this for now going on 25, 30 years.
What role do you feel like your identity as like a diasporic settler of color and Muslim anarchist play into your political awakening with movements like the anti-war, Zapatista, Arab Spring?
A lot of reflecting on that. I'm an Arab, but I'm also a North African. I'm born in Egypt, right? So, the reason I brought up, Nasser with regards to my father, because I was weaned, if you will, breastfed, pan-Arab, but also arguably pan-African as well as pan-Islamist politics simultaneously at the same time. So I was reading Patrice Lumumba, Walter Rodney, the list is really endless. It was the convolution of the Du Boisian identity crisis, the double consciousness. Who am I? Am I Arab? Am I African? Am I Muslim? These are the choices that white supremacy, the acronyms, BIPOC, LGBTIQ, as if you can easily slot yourself into one category, but that's how white supremacy operates, and we internalize that, right? As if there aren't Afro-Indigenous people because of the confluence of, Black and Indigenous relations on Turtle Island. So it was coming to an understanding that I'm not just one of these things. I'm a conjunction. I'm a conjunctive and. I'm not a disjunctive or, and I refuse to internalize, to replicate that dictum and that reality that has been imposed upon me. And it is then that I came to an understanding, as Fanon had noted, that not only is decolonization an inherently violent act, because it involves that rupturing of oneself and repiecing one is never done with, but also simultaneously that I needed to learn how to redream dangerously. I needed to imagine, as the Zapatistas had noted, a world where all worlds belong. There is no indigenous liberation without Black self-determination. There is no Palestinian liberation or land back, and that's part of my problem with 16 months of an ongoing genocide in which we're scrolling doomsday on phones mined from another genocide of copper and cobalt that is ongoing on the Congo, let alone in the Sudan, let alone with the Uyghur, with the Rohingya, and so on in Kashmir. These are all genocides, interconnected genocides in my world. And we can talk about why then 1492 became such a significant prism by which I see the world, read the world, and the intersection of struggles that way. And truly the fact that nobody's free till everybody, there is no liberation for everybody until we're all liberated. But the question is, what does that actually mean? And how does it manifest? Practically, theoretically, I mean, Bell Hooks taught us, theory is a form of laboratory praxis. We talk about Walter Rodney, the guerrilla intellectual. Again, the world where all worlds fit. My elder, Gustavo Esteva, who passed away during the pandemic, very much a public intellectual, organic intellectual. So it's not something reserved for the ivory towers. And there is no pure space either. And of course, I understand, academic elitism and careerism and so on. But I would say that it was my organizing that led to my intellectual sort of forays in an interdisciplinary way than the other way around. Because I didn't mention this, but I originally started as an engineer. I studied engineering. I graduated as an engineer. I never loved it. I never liked it. I'd leave my classes and I'd go sit in classes on Black studies, on Indigenous studies, on gender studies. It was that thirst, that hunger, because our cultures as Black, Indigenous people of color are inherently polyamorous, polymorphic, polyvalent. And so this idea that Foucault would say, the development of the intellectual, that, oh, well, the intellectual expertise, that, oh, well, you just study biology or chemistry or just Black studies or Indigenous studies. There was an inherent revolt within me to do something like that. No, I needed to understand the Black condition in Turtle Island, but also in Africa because of Black on Black ethnocentrism. It's reality. I needed to understand that in order to understand anti-Blackness and Arab supremacy within Southwest Asian and North African Muslim and non-Muslim communities, and how anti-Blackness operates hypervisibly, invisibly, intersectionally, but also distinctively within the context of Africa, but also on Turtle Island. These become the nuances because of, again, what white supremacy had done in terms of pit us against one another in this oppression Olympics. So Palestine isn't an exception. I mean, she's only an exception insofar as, again, if we actually listen to her. Not pre-imposing a 1948, a 1917-18 narrative based on British contrived borders. Why should I accept that? Gaza is a part of Rafah and the Levant. It's part of North Africa, actually, geographically. Oh, and the rest of Palestine is part of the region of the Levant. So it's beginning to think outside the box. And that's what I learned. And that moment of introspection became so poignant, really. And I have to be thorough and honest with my engagement with Indigenous people, Mohawks of Tantanega, Akwesasne, Kanasatage, because I was literally like going there over the weekend, be it by a friend's transportation or my own car when I did afford to have a car of my own, and spending time around the fire and sitting down on storytelling, narrating. The stupidity of assuming that, oh, well, one should feel guilty. Guilt is a reactionary emotion, a motive that doesn't lead to anything. We're all bound to mess up because of the stereotypes that we've internalized of one another. That's sort of like the mass psychology of fascism. That's the greater jihad that we have to do. But how else but to not teach one another, because that's a noun. That assumes that I'm teaching you all. No, how we're learning from one another. Because teaching assumes that one has to submit oneself to somebody else to teach them, as opposed to us, as the Zapatistas again say, holding each other's hands and learning and not leaving anybody behind and co-learning together so that we don't leave any of our siblings behind.
I really resonated with what you were saying about being around the fire and storytelling and understanding shared space through that lens and co-learning. I guess as someone who's been a part of different movements, like how do you kind of toe the line between showing up to a space or movement and being in solidarity versus that kind of co-learning kind of perspective or mindset, which I think is maybe a bit more shared or less hierarchical? Like, do you have any thoughts or distinctions on that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you. That is, again, a brilliant question. I've always thought about that question. I've written on that question in the book, but I've never actually been asked that question. So thank you so much. Solidarity is a verb. We all know that. But solidarity is not exercised at times of war. You just don't jump on top of the Black Spring when, and again, this is the irony. Do we not have Trayvon Martin's, Michael Brown's, George Floyd's, Breonna Taylor's, and so on and so forth? Where is the discourse insofar as abolition and anti-Blackness and Black life and so on and so forth? You just don't jump on. I understand that there is this moment of awareness that comes into play. Of course, we all have learning to do. But this is the difference between sort of the co-optation of struggles, the streaming of struggles, the Instagramming. Oh, look, I'm at a Black Lives Matter protest. Where's the constant and consistent dedication? I'll tell you a story. And it's not one that I share really often. I remember in the Culverstone Tract standoff that happened with, like I said, the Mohawks, Ganasatake Akwesasne. I remember getting the call because I was, at that point I was a part of the anarchist community, etc. It was predominantly white. We all know most lefty movements are white and animated by whiteness, right? And there's always that degree of discomfort because, engaged in spiritual practices, etc., etc. There's an anti-religious thing that animates the entire left, really, Marxism, anarchism, and so on and so forth, right? Which is ironic given the fact that the land is a spiritual subject. She's not an object. At a very important point, land is not an anthropomorphic piece of property, which is a problem that I have with Marxism, right? Where's the metaphysical component of this beyond the historical materialism? Hey, anarchists are Marxists too. I appreciate historical materialism, dialectics, so on, but come on, right? Where's the divine intervention? Where is what in Islam is referred to as al-ghaib, or the unknown? There are verses in the Quran that are referred to as the verses of al-ghaib because nobody knows the meaning of. Chapter number 2, chapter of the cow, and there are many chapters named after non-human life. See, Muslims don't even think about this. The chapter of the sun, the chapter of the bees, the chapter of the moon, the chapter of the cow, and so on, right? The verse starts Alif Lam Mim. Nobody knows the meaning of that verse. Nobody, no Muslim scholar can tell you the meaning of that verse. 3 Arabic letters conjoined to form an Arabic word. My point being is, so it's in that fire, sitting around on the land, face to face, where the eyes are the windows to the soul. It's practically the only thing I agree with Hegel on. And I remember we got a call. Hey, it's going down. And the Culverstone Tract, very briefly, the Canadian government, the settler colonial government of so-called Canada, was trying to seize Mohawk territory and to mine it because Canada is one of the largest, Canadians like to think of themselves as sort of the non-Americans, peace-loving, multicultural liberals of the world, right? This is part of the facade, but they control 70% of the world's mining corporations in Africa and otherwise. So they've bored into the earth to unravel to the extent of its very undoing. And that I have a great deal of rage with regards to. We got the call. It was in the evening and said, listen, we need these supplies, flashlights, obstruction, construction material, blankets. I mean, it was in the middle of dead winter. So me and a couple of white anarchists, we get into the car. We drive down there. Of course, we're grabbing construction material because there's construction going on at the university and it's Thursday night. I'll never forget that because that's the night in which most Queen's students, Queen's University is where I went to, would go out and would party, right? And they're like, oh, you shouldn't be doing that. That doesn't belong to you. I'm just like, the hell with you sort of type thing. We went, we took the material, we showed up. And because I had invested in years in knowing the Mohawks and so on, the warriors were there. They sort of cordoned the area, and we could sort of like see the snipers, Canadian snipers, white supremacists, right across the fields. And they're like, "Hey, Mohamed, how are you?" and so on. And great, God bless you. Listen, we got what we can. Just tell us, do you want us inside? No. And then at a certain point, one of the warriors was just like, "Listen, one of my friends, it's a warrior." Sean Brandt was inside. He was in a meeting. They were all in a serious meeting, and these are standoffs, right? These are real life situations in which it's a life and death. That prepared me for Tahrir, certainly, but different discussion. But I was just like, no, keep Sean. He's in an important meeting. Listen, call us at any point. We got back in the car and the 2 white anarchists were just ranting. How dare they? How dare they not invite us in, not have us, and so on. Right? But what gets crazy is that, and this is where the story becomes really elucidating. Within a few days, I got another call. Mohamed, we want you in the inside. Absolutely, of course. You got to place your life on the line. That's what it entails. Sorry, like that's what relationships beyond solidarity, because solidarity means just like some people construct it as an instrument of utility. I mean, we say it with Israelis, it's just like, or Zionists, hey, we stood with you black folks during the civil rights movement. Where is that payback for that period of time? It's this economic exchange, but this is where getting to know one another becomes really crucial. And you can't do that behind screens on signal groups. This is why kids, the encampment, Columbia was very different than the way that faculty that is tenured, that is privileged, talking over signal groups. And what they do, they get a call, I'm inside. I'm in there for about 10 days to 2 weeks. I'm the only settler, let alone settler of color, that's inside there. The warriors are armed. It's just like, hey, I've never been in this kind of situation. And I remember talking to Sean, some of the other warriors. The warriors came down from British Columbia. and so on. And was I afraid? Absolutely. But I remember asking, I was just like, I've never held arms. I don't even know up until this day, right? And they're like, you don't need to. Here's a baton. And I still have that baton, by the way. You don't need to worry. You're with us, but this is the extent to which we want you to be involved insofar as that. Okay. 10 days later, Sean is just like, listen, we need you to go back to the city because we want you to mobilize within the city, stop traffic, pass leaflets, and so on and so forth. And at the time, we had started a workers' cooperative. It was the Sleepless Go. So we were already starting alternatives on the ground. The cooperative was catering to homeless. There was free soup, free dessert, free food, no questions asked, free bread baked every day. It was a workers' cooperative. So we're not just talking about a union here. We're talking about sort of the Argentina 2001 type style where it's just like, nah, I'm not just going to unionize. I'm going to take over the factory. Then as soon as I get back into the city, I swear to God, I get a call from one of the warriors, Mike, and he tells me, hey, do you know these two? I'm going to say their names, although I do remember. Do you know these two? Their names are X and Z. I was like, yeah. They're like, they tried to come in and they say that they know you.
Oh, wow.
And they put them on the phone. So X says to me and is crying. I swear to God, I will never forget. And I'm about to start my shift too at the cooperative. Oh my God, they're starting to slit our throats. And I said, why do you think that that is? Why do you think that that is? I mean, there's COINTELPRO, there's a lot of history there. You should already know.
Ooh,
It's the
wow.
first time you show up. They don't know you. They have no reason to trust you at all. You never invested one time in showing up before that. It's now that you saw the excitement of, again, the Black Spring, the Tahrir, Occupy, etc. It's the euphoria. But that's the reactionary, anti-colonial, baggage that isn't focused on decolonial futurities that involve an investment in new kinds of relationships, of dealing with the monsters that we have in front of one another, of undressing ourselves. And so I told X, okay, so I hope you got the lesson. Please put Mike back on. Yes, I know them. I'm vouching for them. Please realize that it is my relationships that are now on the line for you. And I ain't letting go of that. Not for two white kids. So we go back to your question, your very important question. This is an ongoing investment daily, wherever we are. The fact that I'm in Egypt speaking to you right now does not mean that I'm not beholden to the fact that, again, I'm a settler of color on Turtle Island and that I owe service. Not even owe, sorry, erase that. It's not a matter of owing. The responsibility I have taken on from a spiritual, from a racial perspective must mean that I have to think transnationally and operate locally. But I need to be in constant service to my peoples and movements, to constantly center Turtle Island, the confluence of histories vis-a-vis 1492 that I mentioned earlier, in every action that I do, and to be able to distinguish between strategy and tactic and so on and so forth. But to me, that's what going beyond solidarity. That's why hospitality, you see, the left doesn't even have a culture of hospitality. Something I break up in the book. We don't even have an ethics of disagreement or conflict resolution. How do we offer hospitality to one another? How do we break bread with one? How are you supposed to, we're supposed to get to know one another? Forgive me. Of course, I'm very grateful for this opportunity just over Zoom. Are we supposed to do it while we're just standing on a street corner? Why don't we sit on the street corner? Why don't we invite each other to each other's homes? Why don't we cook, celebrate, mourn? That's where, because look, establishing alternative communities and living together is hard. We have found a social center in the same city. It still exists. But I tell you, my siblings, within a year, the original founders, they had split apart because it's not easy living with one another. There are pet peeves, the dishes, the laundry, when music is supposed to be loud, when not. It's like if two couples struggle to stay with one another in a relationship and not get divorced, how hard must it be to think through community and to be in unison with one another, again, in a consistent, constant way?
Because I didn't know this much that you were involved with the co-op, which is, I feel like, some way of how do you still view that, especially as an anarchist, as an alternative economic institution, as something that can displace capital's role in our life while also talking about being involved with the consumer level, or how does that also involvement play out into your education, and how do you feel like you could still, or you still use that?
I always say, whenever I hear the word dismantle, I cringe. I don't need to dismantle Jack, and we don't have the capacity because I don't believe in mass movements. I really don't. That leads to a logic of hegemony, this vanguardist thing. But again, the Panthers weren't large in numbers, the Zapatistas weren't larger in numbers, but they didn't emerge just on the scene. They'd been organizing tens, at least in the case of the Zapatista, a decade before. What did the Panthers do? Did they start with holding guns? No. Breakfast programs, clinics, schools. Yeah, of course, we have the right to defend our communities. That is inherently right. That is enshrined in international law, but I don't need the white man's law to enshrine that law for me. But the point being that the creation of alternatives to me means divesting. It's very ironic, right? We sit down and talk about, let's say generally on the left, we're anti-capitalist this. Anti-capitalism is sort of a rhetorical position. Where are the non-capitalist practices upon which we found are organizing our alternative societies? To me, that's a more important question. From an Islamic perspective, from a radical Black traditional perspective, from an indigenous perspective, all kinds of languages, all kinds of concepts, all kinds of practices. And in Islam, you read the book, I give that. Well, there's no usury, there's no interest. We got the concept of zakah, and zakah is not charity. It's sort of the right of the poor over those that are better off. So there are concepts, practices. There is no concept of property in Islam because all property belongs to God, ultimately, including our own being, including the nations and tribes of non-human life that exist. We sit down, we're mostly urbanized as people of color. Who controls the Rust Belt I-4 land-based corridor in the US?
Microsoft,
Right?
E4, Bell
The white
institution.
rednecks.
Yeah.
It's white people, rednecks or not. Okay, to be fair,
The redneck's probably just as poor as us, but it's definitely Bill Gates.
right?
Yeah.
But they're the ones that are armed to the teeth. They're the ones that feed the metropolis. But we are taught, white civilization teaches us to look down on the rural, the periphery, the primitive, et cetera, et cetera. So we've been gentrified, we've been urbanized. Even indigenous people have been displaced from their land. We've all been disconnected from our symbiotic relationship, that umbilical cord to our Mother Earth. And yet we sit down and talk about the defeat of capitalism. We can't even grow our own food to feed ourselves, let alone our own families and communities.
Yeah, even the rural aren't landowners. So this divide, and then it all goes to the suburban who get to live out this American nightmare, this fever dream to, again, a cycle that they don't want to recognize.
And that's why Malcolm called it a nightmare. We didn't land on Plymouth Rock. Plymouth Rock landed on us. That's the truth, because there was a reason, as Vine Laurier Jr., as a lot of Black elders, scholars, ancestors, there was a reason Andrew Jackson had rescinded that 40 acres and a mule, particularly the 40 acres, because heaven forbid, Black people whose history has been marked with an X, whose name has been marked with an X, whose lives, and who were agriculturals and engineers and philosophers and thinkers and so on and so forth. I mean, we don't have Black Muslim empires back in the day? Of course we did. A third to a fifth of the transatlantic Middle Passage siblings were Muslims from the Iberian Peninsula, the west coast of Africa. And yet that's severed. No, they should have access because, God forbid, they have access to that means self-determination. And that's the irony. And how white supremacy, again, this is the insidiousness of it. Indigenous people have been conscripted in certain nations and even in certain families towards Black enslavement. This is how we have Black Cherokees and Black Mi'kmaq. But simultaneously, Black people were conscripted towards indigenous extermination. Mm-hmm. But this is also why Afro-Indigenous futurities are intertwined. You don't have a Black spring. You don't have Black self-determination without indigenous sovereignty and vice versa. So this is what becomes key. So how do we build on that? Me as a settler of color, living, again, on Turtle Island. This is what becomes key. And it's not just there. Probably you already know, but maybe for our audiences. I mean, my PhD took 10 years because obviously the frauhtness of Tahrir in 2011 and everything else. And it just happened. Research, beautiful research, ethnographic research. I'm not going to say anthropological because that's a sick and disgusting word, but ethnographic, participant or observation, where you are part of the communities that you were in struggle with. I learned a lot from them, our queer siblings, because what ended up being is the fact that the communities that I engaged in here, especially in Tahrir, the trauma, etc., were mostly queer, Black, Nubian, and Sudanese Egyptians. It just happened to be that way. So obviously the theme of anti-blackness, of Arab supremacy, of Sunni supremacy, and so on and so forth really unraveled themselves. But it wasn't only here. This is what I mean. Nubians have been displaced 4 times in Egyptian society, 3 of which were during Nasser, a socialist, pan-Arab, pan-Africanist president. Until this day, they cannot wear their traditional clothing, which is white, until they return to their homeland. And the Egyptian state likes to, of course, use Nubians as a marketing tool for Egyptian tourism, insofar as look at this pharaonic yore, and we come from Nubian kings and queens. Well, where's the respect insofar as the anti-blackness, the blackface that plays out? And ironically, when? Every single Ramadan, in talk shows, in movies, in everything, on top of the visceral violence that Black people face here every single day. This is the disconnect, or the connect. Because then my interviews, and again, this is what happened, was with Black and non-Black Muslims in the context of Turtle Island. So I could understand the whole picture of, again, the rubble of what 1492 had left behind. So, and at a certain point, maybe, because I keep on referring to 1492.
Our podcast is a tool for learning, and we're taking it further on Patreon. By supporting us, you'll gain access to exclusive reading episodes where we unpack key texts and ideas, plus early access to interviews with radicals and revolutionaries. Your contribution helps to make these resources more accessible and impactful. Visit patreon.com/the Dugout Pod to support our work.
It's I was about to say it's a two-way street. It isn't. It's relational, symbiotic. This is the affect. And look, I've done enough podcasts with, white, with, people of color, etc. But this is the flourishing when a genuine commitment to spiritual, ethical, political praxis, and an investment and understanding of the struggles that we face. So gratitude be to God and to all of you all and our ancestors.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, it's also something that we love on this show is like it's an active archive of the history that we're actively living through. And that's also one of the things as me personally that like gives me such revitalization is like Joe Nina Irving hit us up because they knew somebody that listened to the show and gave and like they asked us for information and like just being able to have like continuous conversations and like a dialogue is yeah, a beautiful part of the experience.
Absolutely. If I may just say something about that, brother. Everybody loves and goes on about, again, our shining Black prince, Malcolm. But one thing I often notice that a lot of people don't think about, the beauty about this man is that he wasn't an ideologue. The beauty about this man is his endless capacity, may he rest in heaven, his endless capacity to engage in metamorphosis. The Malcolm before and after prison is not the same as the Malcolm before and after the nation, is not the same as the Malcolm before and after Mecca. So to me, just to maybe just say this one point, and not in any way that, God forbid, I would compare myself again to this exemplary, beautiful soul. But to me, the question was, when I was writing this text, when I was thinking through who and what I am, was what would Malcolm say today, insofar as a Quran of the oppressed? What would he say about his friendship with a queer Black man by the names of James Baldwin, insofar as a queer Islam? What would he say about Arab supremacy? He came from Saudi Arabia. He ate from the same plate that the white man did. But again, we are born in the times that we are, and our mission is to build on what our ancestors had begun. And this is what pains me, that in this moment, people are using, and this is not to take away from Patrice or Walter or any of our ancestors, but you're replicating the same formulas that they engaged in incomplete ways even, and you expect different results. Well, Walter was critical of the nation state, but you're stuck with the state, and you don't want to think through that. Despite the fact that it's a product of colonialism, it is our father just as much as capitalism is our mother. And it's just like, okay, so you see capitalism is colonial and racial and all that, but you don't see the nation state as problematic in any way. But this is where, again, we have Lorenzo, we have Ashanti, we have William C. Anderson, God bless, that have pushed the bound of, again, and I appreciate Black Marxism, of course, again, but how do we go beyond and push that emblem further?
Yeah, how have you seen that energy and that edge through your own work as a Muslim anarchist with the Anarcha Islam? I mean, it's something I've looked into. My family, my dad is Muslim, we're Fulla, and I've like looked around, like trying to find like anti-authoritarian jihads and stuff throughout the past, and which is where I really appreciated your work. And I also feel like what is like that conversation around like the relationship with Islam government, the state, but also like the just anarchic impulse, the humanist,
Yeah.
if one wants to call it that, or however you want to define
Right.
around this conversation.
For the longest time, those anarchists that are as a part of the community, they're referring to me as the anarchist that doesn't acknowledge that he's an anarchist. And there was a reason for that. And there still is, because the irony is, okay, I'm a Muslim anarchist, I'm an anarchist Muslim. What comes before the other? There only makes sense when, again, I don't claim that identity, because what is the point of claiming that identity? There is a point to which I address Muslims and anarchists because of the seeming disconjunction between both. Because what? Islam, anarchism, all the stereotypes in relationship to both. Islam is mistranslated to submission. Islam doesn't mean submission. The word actually in Arabic was for submission is khudu'. Islam comes from the word salama, to willfully deliver, to deliver upon choice, because the Quran teaches and uses phrases as أَلَا يَتَفَكَّرُونَ أَلَا يَعْقِلُونَ أَلَا يَفْهَمُونَ, do they not think, do they not reflect? But of course, Orientalists and Muslims replicate this idea that it means submission. Why? Because it gives the illusion that, forgive me for phrasing it this way, I don't mean to be so crass, that we bend our asses to the sky 5 times a day and we don't reflect. I mean, this is the stereotype, right? This is just what we do, right? We've domesticated our faith. But anarchism is similarly misinterpreted, and it's misinterpreted in, your America over here when it's translated as anarchy, as chaos. I always see it as a disordered order, because it is an order that trembles upon indignation at the sight of injustice. I see it as involving spiritual and ethical political commitments, but then my point becomes, what if I inherently believe that Islam is inherently anarchistic? Why should I identify as an anarchist? What is the point of that label? If Islam, in my world, in my conceptual, and this was the point of this project, it wasn't to provide a Muslim anarchistic historiography of examples historically of Muslim anarchy. That's actually been done, and I referenced that in the book. But nobody's ever come up with a theological, political, Quranic interpretation on why the Quran, because it's the same text that Muslims all across the world, whether you're part of the nation, whether you're Sunni, whether you're Shiite, whether you're an Ismaili, whether you're Sufi, whether you're ISIS, whether you're Al-Qaeda, whether you're Hezbollah, whether you're Islamic Jihad, whether you're Iran, that's the caliber, that's the barometer. So that's going to be my terrain of battle. So when we go step a moment back, so anarchism in Arabic, actually, a lot of people translate it. I'm going to go do an event in Berlin or whatever, and they applied the mistranslation. And what was it? Oh, it's Fawdawiya. It's actually written on the book. The book cover, the artist, the person who made it is actually a Palestinian brother of mine. We've known one another long time, an amazing artist. And he included the mistranslation of anarchism, which is Fawdawiya, on the cover. But he also included the proper translation, which is La Sultawiya, which means without authority, because that's the proper interpretation. But when one thinks about it, okay, again, Sankara, Turi, they all were very clear. And this is Turi now, Kwame. Our people have never known religion as the opium of the masses. That, of course, comes directly from the secular, colonial, European culture that, again, played this trick on us. Because there is no such thing as secularist, Enlightenment project.
Yeah, and I want to add to that because I feel like so much of what you're describing and the beauty of like the work that you've done and the research and just like the actualizing is in so many cultures or backgrounds where people have experienced colonization, we've experienced like subjugation. I don't know, like when I look at blackness, like a few years ago, I went to Tulsa, Oklahoma, where like major race riots were, and I got to visit one of the only churches that survived, and I got to like meet this preacher, and he was basically saying for enslaved Africans that were on those ships, the ultimate emancipation for the slave was death. And when I heard that, I thought about how so much of the black experience is literally like saying that death is like a greater liberation, or the possibility of death is a greater liberation than the chaos that we're offered. And that's why I feel like we've loved this podcast so much, is because it's helping me name what's already been there. Like, black people I grew up with steal all the time. They do crime. They fucking hate the cops. And like, how do we both recognize that it's already there, but also, to your point, provide language or context or shared space for like these deeper discoveries to happen?
And on a spiritual, metaphysical level as well, religion and revolution go hand in hand. Religion and revolution go hand in hand. This is the arrogance, I feel, that everything has to be predetermined. This revolution that's supposed to be some kind of calculus, well, having lived to revolutions in 2011, that I was for, in 2013, that I was opposed to, as I saw my own people engage in acts of genocide against the Muslim Brotherhood in two cities. I'm no fan of the Muslim Brotherhood. That doesn't mean that what went down was right either. This is the irony. And I was so livid during Tahrir because I said that a lot of secularist leftists, revolutionary Marxist, Leninist, socialists, etc., and to anarchists as well. Please, let's recognize the divine grace and power that this moment has arrived, because Egyptians have gotten so pharaonic, right? They're just like, look what we did. Look what we accomplished. Look what we're going to show the world. It's just like, learn from our Black siblings, learn from our indigenous siblings, the Zapatistas, the Panther, and so on and so forth. But nah, we're going to come up with our own thing. And what happened in 2013 could have happened in 2011, but by the grace of God, those 18 days, that doesn't mean that it was utopia. Of course, there was gender and sexual harassment, but that wasn't the overarching theme. Women were manning checkpoints. We had Ligan Shabiya, which means, community councils in each neighborhood, let alone on the streets, anti-sexual harassment groups. But Tahrir was filled with, Muslim Brotherhood, Nasrites, Sadatists, anarchists, Marxists, every breed that you can imagine. We even had a queer tent. There was a pride march, for God's sake, in Tahrir. But this is the difference that Kwame Ture points to in terms of the difference between mobilization and organization. Mobilization is about issues. Organizing is about structures. And this is the problem with regards to this genocide that is going on. Okay, please, somebody tell me, we're out on the streets. Same thing with the Black Spring. I mean, it's the same formula that gets us nowhere. You got conservative Muslims that are queerphobic and sexist and misogynist, that don't see the value of critical race or Black studies or indigenous studies. The woke. Fuck woke. And you got anti-spiritual leftists. You got queer communities. You get anti-Zionist Jews that are just like free Palestine. Like Tahrir. Bread, freedom, and social justice slogans. What the hell do those things mean? Because I asked in Tahrir, what does bread mean to you? What does social justice mean to you? What does freedom mean to you? And you'll get different answers, even from within the same encampment. Even from within the same. And so nobody can tell me what a free Palestine means like. For who? For who exactly?
Big subject that a friend of mine happened when they actually went to the New York encampments. They went there and they were like, Free Palestine means so many different things to so many different people here. Half of them want the US type federation system. Like, and I'm sitting there in a meeting right next to them and I'm just visiting here. I'm just visiting these spaces, but then there's sitting right next to other people. So it's like, what does that coalescent or coalition space mean?
Also, just add to that, even here locally in Ohio, when the encampment protests popped off last year, like, I got to tap in a little bit, and I even saw that conflict behind the scenes, like whether or not people wanted to listen to the cops, whether or not people were worried about what the media would say, and all of these other distinctions around like optics. But yeah, I think there was like just so much under the surface.
Yeah, no, it became such a circus, right? Because you had politicians, you had, I sort of want to name names, but at the same time, it's just like, what's the point, right? You had academics, famous. We know who showed up, who was given speeches. And at a certain point, I said to the students, because again, I was just playing an advisory role whenever they wanted to ask me, listen, this is becoming a circus. And they're like, yeah, no more speeches by these people inside the encampment. This encampment is just going to be about teachings. And I was the only professor that actually did the first, certainly. I think maybe there was somebody else, so that I'm not misspeaking, but certainly the first that did the last 2 weeks of teachings inside the encampment. with regards to my course on queer and feminist decolonial abolitionist understandings from BIPOC traditions, if you will. But the role of spirituality, people are in awe of the sumud of Palestinians. Oh, we're relishing over the fact that there are converts, reasons to stop. What Islam are you converting to? I mean, this is the problem with 9/11. What Islam? Because again, the Quran is very clear. وَكَمْ مِنْ فِئَةٍ قَلِيلَةٍ غَلَبَتْ فِئَةً كَثِيرًا. And white supremacists flipped out when I said that. How many of a small group defeated a larger enemy? But at the same time, I said, the Quran says, وَأَعِدُّوا لَهُمْ مَا اسْتَطَعْتُم مِّن قُوَّةٍ, and prepare for them what is necessary in strength. Prepare what is necessary in strength. Again, build so that you have something to actually protect. This was the original journey and message of the Prophet, because Muslims were being persecuted, murdered, killed, boycotted. They were left to rot by their own families, nailed down in the heat of the sun of Arabia. Recant from Islam, and we will accept you back. And Muslims had to migrate first to Abyssinia underneath the King Najis, the Ethiopian king who became a Muslim on his deathbed, and then after that to Medina, because it wasn't about going to war. It was learning how to build community with people that are like you and that aren't like you. So this is, again, what becomes key. It's an understanding of, and maybe if you don't mind, why 1492 is really important. You cannot, in my humble opinion, you cannot achieve racial emancipation without religious emancipation. Race and religion go hand in hand. Why? Because in 1492, Muslims and Jews, what were they referred to in Andalusia? Savage and heathen. Savage being the racial definition, heathen being the religious. Sadiya Hartman wrote about this, Ila Shohat wrote about this, I wrote about this, and Linda Kikovic, whose book, amazing book, you should pick it up. I really encourage you all to also invite her. Incredible Kumpa wrote this book, Palestine 1492, that just came out. Same thing. Savage and heathen. Muslims and Jews were persecuted, we were murdered, we were raped, we were pillaged underneath the auspices of Ferdinand and Isabel. Why? Because also they were preparing vis-a-vis Columbus to engage in a crusade to reclaim Jerusalem. And of course, we know that Christianity is an Eastern tradition that was usurped underneath Constantine and weaponized as an imperial tool of conquest. But then Columbus is sent, he thinks he's going to India, he ends up in the Caribbean. What does he say in his diaries? He labels indigenous people as savage and heathens, but then it doesn't end there. Hernan Cortez, the 15th century conquistador, what does he refer to? He refers to Aztec women as Moorish women, Aztec temples, Moorish mosques. Montezuma, the Aztec leader, is a sultan. To spirit people, Berdach, the same term that was being used to cast gender nonconforming Muslims. How can religion not be a part of it? And then we, of course, talked about a third, a fifth of our Black siblings being Muslims for that very percent. So how can you tell me Islam is not a part of this? Religion is not no, this is a racial religious war, not one between Muslims and Jews, but rather one that Muslims and Jews have been conscripted into vis-a-vis white supremacist imprints of Christianity onto both, onto Judaism in the manifestation of Zionism and onto Islam in the manifestation of Wahhabi, Salafist, as well as Muslim Brotherhood thought. But those are the options that I reject, because as I say, my choices will not be between a Euro-American crusading Zionist Wahhabi alliance and a Russian, Chinese, totalitarian, Iranian axis on the other. Sorry, I reject. We owe ourselves to be able to dream beyond those false binaries and options. This is why we have the mess in Syria. This is why the Arab Spring failed, and this is why liberation generally fails, because we're refusing to acknowledge where is, again, Malcolm, where is MLK, where is the continuation of that legacy, or have we not learned nothing? Nat Turner, was he not spiritual? Tolstoy, Shariati, Dorothy Day, Jack Ellul, the list goes on, Abdul-Dar, Jaffrey. So why not open up that horizon? Because again, we have complicated, understandably, relationships with religion, institutionalized versus non-institutionalized, authoritarian versus non-authoritarian. But this is where the work needs to happen.
I feel like that's something a lot that me and some of my friends have been trying to break down, especially earlier we did this Afro-pessimist episode,
Right.
and there were some folks that got back and talked about how exactly the thing of like there could be no Arab slave trade because there is no property in Islam, and they were like, and all this stuff and talking, and I feel like there's that conversation of what is institution, what is rank and file, I hear a
Mhm.
lot of things from, I mean, some, it's mainly online and academic spaces of now of recognizing like the Islamist vanguard in the region and in that area of learning from Marxist struggles and anti-colonial and decolonial struggles in the region, and now is the vanguard militant front. And kind of that understanding of like of what you're saying of having that grounding to be able to one, reject that analysis,
Mm.
but two, still be able to read and understand what materially brings that to the forefront of discourse and to discussion. I mean, I'm curious from your perspective in that discourse and in that discussion, what are some of the things that you pull from either from personal experience, whether it be from knowing people and being on the ground in Tehran and places that you draw that history and that knowledge from?
Just to be clear, are we talking about the Afro-pessimist position with regards to slavery? Are we talking about sort of the manifestation of that in Tahrir Square and anti-blackness? Both?
The experience tour, but then also like regional movements, and then what kind of situations on the ground kind of fights this like what is like the vanguardists against the global imperialism.
I really value, Afro-pessimism a great deal. Wilderson, there's a great deal of richness. And I really appreciate the Afro-pessimist position because because it exposes the brutality of slavery and its reincarnations to this day. Stand your ground laws, police brutality, broken windows, disenfranchisement schools, prison school nexus, 1995 crime bills, Hillary Clinton, Zionist imperialist champagne, sort of Bernie Sanders voted for, the references to racist references to super predators and so on and so forth and so far as Black youth. They expose the brutality of, again, the Black condition, which is one that is to be taken very seriously. My concern is when that drifts, and this is part of Afro-pessimism that I also struggle with, when it drifts into, well, Blackness is the new indigeneity. Because to me, I shudder because that is establishing, again, a reification of a certain oppression Olympics that can be highly problematic,
Yeah.
right? Like, again, this is the ethnic Black on Black race. I mean, again, we know the stereotypes, right? African migrants who become settlers in Turtle Island. It's just like, oh, well, you Black people that are descendants of the Middle Passage. Well, how many years, 400 years, 500 years do you need to get over sort of the indentured servitude and so on and so forth? It's just like put yourself by the bootstraps sort of type thing. Or you're only good to be, oh, well, once in a while, politicians like Mr. Uncle Tom Obama or Kamala, the face of empire, that sort of a thing, right? Mr. Drone president, a Wall Street president. That's what Obama wants. Shamed absentee fathers and so on and so forth. It's just like, look at the structure, look at the elegy and cry of complaint. This is what I appreciate about Afro, the cry of complaint, because Obama was just like, what was the phrase that he used? Stop whining. That's what he said. Stop whining.
Mm.
This is where poets get it right, like Bob Marley and the Wailers, because it's not whining, it's wail. It's a wail. It's a cry of elegant
Hmm.
complaint, of ongoing, undue justice in the most brutish, in your face, without a sense of shame way. But if I take that line of thought, well, what about the ongoing genocide of, again, our indigenous siblings and the erasure of that? So that is the concern that I have with regards to that narrative. Nobody can deny, and this goes globally, mind you. So before I just transition to Tahrir, I want to address the issue of slavery because I think it's something that's very important. And again, Afro-pessimists, I have disagreement on this point. Did all empires engaged in slavery? Now, the meaning of slavery morphed also with time. Now, the majority of slaves, when we look at it in the context of Islam, Jewish empires engaged in Roman empires, Black Muslim empires engaged in slavery. Again, I'm not condoning here slavery, but we need to be very careful because this feeds into white supremacy too, because it allows white people to come and say, and I got to this sort of like review on my book by this white Marxist or socialist or anarchist. She's like, I don't understand why, he just doesn't say, well, it was the same as slavery as the white man, because the reality is it actually wasn't. It was majority Circassians. And again, I'm not condoning slavery, but slaves at different points had the right, actually, first of all, they were still regarded as human. And this is a major point. Sadi Hartman and Sylvia Winter pointed to that white slavery was plantation slavery, and Black people were not regarded as human, let alone as heathens. In the case of Islam, and again, I'm talking about majority of cases here, that is certainly not doctrinally, theologically the case. Slaves were human. Freeing the slave was part of that forgiveness, was actually encouraged, was part of the abolitionist component that Muslims, because again, Muslims lost their way, especially after the four rightly guided caliph. I would say even from the moment that the Prophet died. It's like the moment that Moses goes up to the mountains to receive the 10 commandments. He comes back and Jewish people, Israelites, are now worshiping the golden calf. And this is the reality. Jesus dies. Again, this is why I'm out to resurrect. Where is, again, Moses that stood before Pharaoh? Where is Isa that stood defending Mary Magdalene and flipped the table on the money exchanges within the temple because of interest and the forbiddenness of interest and how it is an exploitation of the poor? Where is Muhammad who stood for the oppressed as well? But then by that logic, no, Muslims, you did not own the slave. What you owned was the relationship between you and the slave. Now, you were encouraged to free the slave, but the slave could own property, they could rise within society, they could marry who they deemed they wanted to marry, and so on and so forth. They could remain on their covenant of spirituality, generally speaking. This is not to condone against slavery. Muslims have reneged that abolitionist trajectory, again, from a very early phase, sadly. And that is the problem that I have with these analogies. Slaves were not central to plantation economies. So, of course, we see, again, manifestations of slavery in the way that I mentioned Nubians, I mentioned Sudanese, people are treated, and so on and so forth. But we see it in terms of, Black people, even people of color more generally, the camel jockeying that, particularly in the Arabian Peninsula, right? These kids, in a certain way, become slaves to that dominant order. But this is where it becomes entangled very much with Arab supremacy, with Sunni supremacy. And this is the stupidity because the Quran, the majority of Muslims, we know this in the context of the US, are not migrant Muslims. They're actually Black Muslims. The majority of Muslims in the world are not Arab Muslims. This is not a tradition that was sent exclusively to Arabs. This is the tradition that, yes, the revelation was in Arabic. And there's a particular wisdom in that. It was meant to humble Arab as any other community with regards to their own language. This is why I mentioned the verses of Al-Ghaib earlier. It's just like, okay, you Arabs, this is your language, yeah? Here are verses that you don't even know the meaning of. Bring me a verse like it if you can. So, of course, Muslims use Black people now as sort of, oh, we can't be racist. Look at Bilal, the Mu'adhin of the Prophet, who had the most beautiful call to prayer. And he was always in the Prophet's company. And nobody, as long as Bilal was around, would give the call to prayer. They use
a
it
Black
as
friend.
Exactly. Oh, look, but you know who also did that? I mean, if we carry that logic to conclusion, and I will never forget, by the way, and this is a true story. I'm sitting in a meeting, in a department meeting, and it's so disgusting. I really feel in revolt. But again, one says this story and storytelling because there are lessons here. And I'm sitting in a meeting and we're arguing about the importance within sociology of bringing critical race theory, of Black studies, and so on. And she's like, but this is sociology and you already have a Black studies department. I have a Black kid that I adopted. I don't remember, to be quite honest, where she adopted her son from. And she's like, I stroke Black skin every day. So I can't be a racist. It's like, excuse me? That's what Washington and the founding fathers and the slave. Exactly. Look at the sickness, though, the degree of psychosis. Just like, excuse me, but that's the logic that, again, carried to conclusion. That's what you're saying. You're then not invested in Black people. You're tokenizing Black people. You're instrumentalizing. You're appropriating them. Come on. Are we lying to ourselves when we come and say within Muslim communities, particularly in diaspora, right? This is the sham that the lies that we tell ourselves. Again, it's an open secret. It's not even a secret. But the fact that a lot of diasporic migrants want their aunts, their uncles, their mommies, their daddies, want their kids that are people of color, okay, South Asian, Arab, blah, 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 to marry white reverts and converts. Oh, why? Oh, because in a generation or two, the grandkids, this is the idea of skin bleaching creams that are prominent in India. This is the straightening of hair, the degree of self-loathing and resentment. But when it comes to a black man, when it comes to a black woman, black whoever, it's just like, nah, we can't go there. But that is precisely the problem. It manifests itself in so many ways. Tahrir, in the kinds of theories that we're being engaged in, that sadly, Black people were constantly swept to the side. Black queer, Black feminist, and so on and so forth. But again, I was blessed to be within a group of queer siblings, Black and non-Black, that were very attuned to these dynamics. What I couldn't stomach is the fact that the anarchist scene, the Marxist-Leninist scene, could not understand the value on a psychological level, on a trauma level, that they have internalized colonialism to a degree that needed to be undone. And their sense of responsibility that way. So, it's just like, I saw this discussion. I don't know if you all came across it at a certain point. It was so sad and disgusting. At a certain point when Kamala came to the scene, obviously that split Black Palestinian Twitter. And then if we notice, it split Black and Black Muslim Twitter, because she's like, hey, you're privileging your religion over your race. See, this is the race-religion formula that needs to be reaffirmed. But I remember some Palestinians coming about and say, we don't call Black Palestinians Black Palestinians. They're just Palestinians. We don't operate on those terms. I was like, excuse me? Like what, the term Abid is not a term that is being used, again, not just within Palestine, but also within the Arabian Peninsula. Oh, you're a slave. Oh, I mean, my name is ABDOU. My last name is ABDOU. It's actually Abdullah, like I'm the slave of Allah, right? But yeah, excuse me? That's always being leveled against Black people. You don't see Arab with passing white skin saying that to one another. So yeah, hopefully that addresses a little bit of sort of the Afro-pessimism, the Tahrir.
Looking ahead, what do you see as some of the most pressing challenges and opportunities for decolonial and anti-imperialist movements in this current moment?
If we looked at our ancestors, the Panthers, the Zapatistas, if I could say that there's a formula for a revolutionary movement, that by studying history, by studying movements, because a lot of people miss out that this is a social movement book. And a lot of people don't read, I love history, but a lot of historians don't read theory and social movement theory. So they stick within the realm of history. And that's a huge problem. History is very important, but you got to operate social movement, and that means theory. And historians don't like to deal with theory. And there are certain patterns to what I described any revolutionary movement has to have. Number one, the creation of alternatives, alternative schools, hospitals. I mean, again, it's the Zapatista Panther model. Kwame set. If you hear a revolutionary talking about destroy, 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 they're not a revolutionary. A revolutionary creates. Revolutionary creates. Okay. Number two, you need to have a story to tell. To me, that's the 1492 narrative that offers that potential to all of us. I try to offer the overarching flame. Why? Because again, that is the lens by which, that is the framing by which actually Black and Indigenous and Muslim and people of color struggles can be seen intertwined with one another. And for us to be able to sort that mess that we are left with, while understanding that, sorry, we all have sellouts within our own communities. And this is why I don't give a damn when somebody introduces themselves, excuse me, as Indigenous or as anarchist or as queer or as whatever. What are the ethical, you could be, again, queer and Zionist, you could be an anarchist and misogynist, you could be Muslim and racist, et cetera, et cetera. To me, what are the ethical, spiritual commitments that define your identity? So we go back to that point. So again, the creation of alternatives and a story to tell. So that one of the most, again, I was most honored in a talk. It was sort of like a group of scholars and activists, Black and Indigenous. And the most heartwarming thing that I heard from my siblings, and I heard it several times, and I hope that that's the case, but I'm going by what they shared with me, is when they said, we can see ourselves in this book. Because that was the goal. I tried to dream a world, again, where all worlds belong. I really did. So whatever limitations that I have, and everybody and everything has its limitations and shortcomings. Number three, the preparation for armed conflict. We are at war. But armed conflict is a tactic. It's not a strategy. This is what leads to Daesh and ISIS. That, okay, we have a right, again. The problem with Daesh and ISIS, okay, you broke the dividing line between Iraq and Syria. But your project is the Ummah, which is where sovereignty lies in Islam. Again, that transnational community of Muslims, believers alike, Because I'll just say this one sort of side note. A lot of people, including Muslims themselves, when they read the Quran, do you know how many times the word Muslim appears? 5 or 6 times. Do you know what the emphasis is on the Quran? Mu'min, which means believer. So part of what I was trying to do in the book is, what are the characteristics that God attributes to the believer? Well, that which does not corrupt in the earth, that minds the rights of the orphan, the poor, those that are enslaved, the elderly, that which doesn't charge interest, doesn't corrupt in the earth. Okay, wow. So now we have a new ontological, epistemological way of understanding believer, whether you're Muslim or not, because the original polity included Muslims, Christians, Jews, Sabians, Zoroastrians, atheists. Then everybody's got to decolonize, and it's easy to say that word, to work through their baggage and traditions. Why are you throwing out Christianity with the bathwater, you bunch of anarchists that overnight are just like, no gods, no masters? I was at a conference in 2011, not to digress, I know we're running out on time. And this guy, I'm not going to say his name, he's supposedly an anarchist. He works on Islam and anarchism, but he sees that the link is through the lens of terrorism. Look at that. And he shows up, he's dressed in a suit, only guy in a suit, right? And he's sitting down and listening. And he's like, his question was, I mean, out of everything that I shared was, last week we might have a bunch of effigies of Moses and Jesus and Muhammad, and we burnt them. How does that make you feel? It's like, well, honestly, I don't know what Muhammad or Jesus or Moses looked like, but, I would never make effigies of Aman, Bakun, and Kropotkin or whatever. He's like, yeah, of course not. Those are our gods. I was like, there you go. So much for the no gods, no masters. But see, this is the irony. Marxism has become a religion. Anarchism is a religion. Capitalism is a religion. The nation state is a religion. And this is what we fail to recognize, right? What is Protestant conceptualizations of property, Victorian notions of gender and sexuality, in God we trust, and the $1 bill? You want to tell me you're not religious?
Yeah, we have our pantheon of our myths, our founding fathers. We even etched them into the very thing we considered sacred and handed out during the Homestead Act, the land. Claim and ownership over indigenous folks in the sacred site. So this whole, like you say, I would like appreciating how it's not secular.
Yeah.
Like there actually is a recognition of something at play
Yeah.
in less than a minute. But that's something anarchists do a lot. Like, oh,
Yeah.
I don't believe in the state, so I'm just gonna ignore that it's there and then live my little life. I'm so grateful for having you on the show. I really hope
My
that we'll
honor.
have more conversations. And
I
I haven't finished the book, but when I do, I would love to have you back on.
I would be so deeply honored. Are you kidding me? You invite me an hour from now, 2 weeks from now, God willing, if I live this long, months from now, I am at your service and our people's. And please, I mean that. If I could be of any service, you are my siblings. I really look forward, God willing, and I mean this sincerely, to meet you, God willing, in person someday on the land. Your question was, what do we need to do? We talked about that. That's what we need to do. And we need to do the 3 things that I'm suggesting that we need to do simultaneously together. But God willing, we will be able to have that encounter